Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Two If by Sea. This is a BookTube series being done by me and by Mark at RichardsonReads. We have laid claim to nautical literature as, I think, the two booktubers with the most extensive nautical history in our past. We've both spent an enormous amount of time on Earth's waterways in very different and often sometimes opposite circumstances. He was often sailing on vessels that were the type of vessels that the vessels I was a passenger on, my captains would not have liked seeing his vessels and would not have wanted a visit from him and his friends. So the experience was very different, but nevertheless pretty extensive. And we realized that that's a universal, that nautical fiction and nonfiction runs throughout literature just in vast amounts. We originally planned on this event, this monthly get-together being a year-long thing, but I think we're probably going to do it forever, and probably sometimes together, especially now that Operation Attica is a green light. I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to talk about specifics. But we're swapping off every month. He'll do fiction, I'll do nonfiction, I'll do fiction, he'll do nonfiction. And this month I get fiction. And it's a name that has come up before on Two If by Sea, but I could not wait any longer. Of course, if it's going to be fiction, I have to do this author. It's Nicholas Monsarrat, who was a dock rat and a sailing enthusiast for his entire life, knew his way around all kinds of vessels. And although he was a pacifist, he still served in World War II on a whole bunch of convoy ships, the so-called little ships of World War II, the frigates and corvettes, that were the guardian vessels of convoys of material and food and oil. Crucial, absolutely crucial convoys that were sitting ducks on the open ocean for U-boats, for Nazi U-boats. There was at the time a thing called ASDIC. It was a kind of primitive sonar. It wasn't particularly good, and it was still in its early stages. And these were in the early days of the war, when those convoys were being protected by frigates and corvettes, and sometimes by battleships. In a kind of group formation around them on the surface, it was mainly for morale or to hunt down ships that had already struck. The convoys didn't provide a whole lot of protection for those ships, especially against dedicated U-boat attacks in coordination. And these were in the early years of the war, when all of this technology was new, and also the Americans had yet to enter the war. So it looked hopeless. It looked like a hopeless cause. And Monsarrat was right there in the heart of it. And then when he got out of the service, his heart also belonged to writing. For a long time. Those were the two loves of his life, the ocean and writing. And he did a whole bunch of writing. Oh my God, short stories, reviews, screenplays, everything, you name it. But he also wrote novels. And he banged out a few, and they're interesting in their way. And then the thing happened to him that it doesn't happen to 1 in 10 authors, even hardworking authors. One of his books caught on, and it was this one from 1951, The Cruel Sea. It caught on. And it sold like the dickens. Edition after edition after edition, reprint after reprint after reprint, endlessly. It almost immediately lodged itself in the short roster of great contemporary war novels. You think of Das Boot, you think of Run Silent, Run Deep, you think of books like that. This is right there in that roster. I would argue the best of them all. And it's the story. It's a novel about corvettes, one in particular, the Compass Rose, that is just on convoy duty. It takes you inside the world of those convoy duties and what they could be like on seas that were sometimes monstrous. Those of you who have never been truly at sea, I'm sure that you loved your cruises, but they don't count. Mark could tell you stories, so could I, about when the ocean is trying to kill you. Truly monstrous seas have to be experienced in order to be believed. They are incredible. Especially, I have been in my share of them, and they are an ordeal. Just an ordeal. There is no way to sleep, first of all. There's barely any way to be comfortable. And it's where the phrase "all hands on deck" comes from, because you're not going to take shifts. If the ocean is trying to destroy your vessel, then you need everybody to help to stop that from happening. And the author captures that perfectly. The ocean is a vivid character in this book. Sometimes calm, but mostly it is viciously antagonistic towards the Compass Rose and everybody else. But the main enemy is, of course, those U-boats. The book captures the whole broad spectrum of war. There are the officious dignitaries. There are the upper ranks who are often clueless. There are the boring days. There are the interpersonality, the interpersonal interactions between the crew members, and how personalities can grate against each other in an enclosed vessel on a long voyage. And the book also takes us ashore to the homes and families of some of our main characters. And the author does us the compliment of not making his ship full of heroes. The ship is not exclusively full of heroes. It's largely full of well-intentioned men who are muddling through in circumstances that they never imagined. The main character in the book was a Fleet Street journalist, and never thought he would find himself at war, serving on a vessel in the open seas. And there are heels and cads and whiners and complainers and incompetents and lazy people. He doffs his head just a little to the conventions of nautical fiction by having the Captain Erickson, be a sterling persona. I want to read you I want to read you a couple of examples from this book just to give you a sense of Monsarrat's prose. The captain carried them all. For him, there was no fixed watch, no time set aside when he was free to relax and, if he could, to sleep. He had to control everything, to drive the whole ship himself. He had to act on signals, to fix their position, to keep his section of the convoy together, and to use his seamanship to ease Compass Rose's ordeal as much as possible. He was a tower of strength, holding everything together by sheer, unrelenting guts. The sight of the tall, tough figure hunched in one corner of the bridge now seemed essential to them all. They needed the tremendous reassurance of his presence, and so he gave it unstintingly, even though the hours without sleep mounted to a fantastic total. He was tired. He could not remember ever having been so tired, but he knew that he was not too tired. There were always reserves. It was part of the job of being captain, the reverse side of the prestige and the respect and the saluting. The tiny ship, the inexperienced officers, the unbelievable weather, he had taken these on as well, and they would not defeat him. So he dealt with everything that came, assuming all cares out of an overflowing strength. He was a professional, the only one among the amateurs who might in future become considerable assets to him, but at the moment were not very much help. And the professional job at sea was not without its rewarding pride. It had to be done, anyway. He was the man to do it, and there was no choice and no two answers. They grew almost to love him toward the end of the voyage. He was strong, calm, uncomplaining, and wonderfully dependable. This was the sort of captain to have. Compass Rose could have done with nothing less, and Compass Rose, butting her patient way homeward under the blows of the cruel sea, was lucky to have him. But the captain isn't always perfect. There's a wonderful moment when he is drunk. He has had to make a horrifying decision at sea at the spur of the moment. He's certain that he's right, but it's still horrifying. Absolutely horrifying, and it's totally his decision. And for the first time in the other character's memory, he gets drunk in his cabin with some sailors that he has recently saved. And he's a mess when that happens. It's a brief scene, but it'll stick with you. It's very moving. But there's another scene that stars the captain that is, I think, the most arresting scene in the book, although that'd be hard to choose because this book is just scene after scene of great stuff, just fantastic stuff. And it shares with a handful of other British 20th century novels a convincing feeling of time passing. You get that, for instance, in Brideshead Revisited. It's a hard thing to do. And those of you who have written fiction will probably agree. It's a hard thing to do convincingly, and this book does it really well. But there's a scene. I want to read this to you as well. There's a scene where the ship has picked up German survivors in the water. Instead of strafing them from the air for fun or running them down with the ship the way the Nazis did, they pick up the survivors. and it's some crew members, and it's also the captain. And Captain Erikson puts the captain in his own cabin, but posts a guard outside the door. And against his own better judgment, he feels that he needs to go and talk to that captain. He's feeling good in the moment about what he's done, about his decision, and he's also feeling a little bit of pride as the victor. Keep in mind, the Compass Rose has been on the losing end of this battle for a long time, and now all of a sudden they succeeded in sinking a U-boat, and they have prisoners. So he goes to the other captain's cabin. I want to read you the scene. I will not do a German accent. The German captain was standing in the middle of the cabin, peering somewhat forlornly out the portal. He turned as Erikson came in and seemed to collect himself into some accustomed pattern, the only one that the world deserved to see. He was tall, dead blonde, and young, nearly young enough to be Erikson's son, but thank God he was not, thought Erikson suddenly, noticing the pale and slightly mad eyes, the contempt that twitched his lips and nostril, the sneer against life, and the hatred of his capture by an inferior. He was young, but his face was old, with some derivative disease of power. There's nothing we can do with these people, thought Erikson, in somber insight. They are not curable. We can only shoot them and hope for a better crop next time. Keep in mind, that is not the way Erikson thinks, but he's already thinking it just on seeing the guy. Hail Hitler, began the German crisply. I wish to... No, said Erikson grimly, I don't think we'll start like that. What's your name? The German glared. Von Helmuth. Captain von Helmuth. You are also the captain? What is yours? Erikson. Ah, a good German name, exclaimed von Helmuth, raising his eyebrows as at some exigence of gentility in a tramp. Certainly not, snapped Erikson. And stop throwing your weight around. You're a prisoner. You're confined here. Just behave yourself. The German frowned at this breach of decorum. There was bitter hostility in his whole expression, even in the set of his shoulders. You took my ship by surprise, Captain, he said sourly. Otherwise... His tone hinted at treachery, unfair tactics, a course of conduct outrageous to German honor, suitable only for Englishmen, Poles, Negroes. And what the hell have you been doing all these months? Erikson thought. He doesn't say it. What the hell have you been doing all these months, except taking people by surprise, stalking them, giving them no chance? But the idea would not have registered. Instead, he smiled ironically and said, It is war. I'm sorry if it is too hard for you. Von Helmuth gave him a furious glance, but he did not answer the remark. He saw, too late, that by complaining of his method of defeat he had confessed to weakness. His glance went around the cabin and changed to a sneer. This is a poor cabin, he said. I am not accustomed. Erikson stepped up to him, suddenly shaking with anger. In the back of his mind, he thought, again, he only thinks it, he doesn't say it, but he's never thought things like this before. In the back of his mind, he thought, if I had a revolver, I'd shoot you here and now. That was what these bloody people did to you. That was how the evil disease multiplied and bred in the heart. When he spoke, his voice was clipped and violent. Be quiet, he snapped out. If you say another word, I shall have you put down in one of the provisions lockers. He turned suddenly to the door. Sentry! The leading seaman on duty, a revolver at his belt, appeared in the doorway. Sir? This prisoner is dangerous, said Erikson tautly. If he makes any sort of move to leave the cabin, shoot him. Then the man's face was expressionless. Only his eyes, moving suddenly from the captain to von Helmuth, gave a startled flicker of interest. Aye, aye, sir, he said. He disappeared again. A little submarine attack of my own going on here. Leave it be. Leave it be. The man, let's see. Von Helmuth's expression hovered between contempt and anxiety. I am an officer of the German Navy, he began. You're a bastard, in any language, Erikson interrupted curtly. He felt another violent surge of anger. I could do it, he thought, in amazement at his wild feeling. I could do it now as easily as snapping my fingers. I'm not particularly interested in getting you back to England, he said slowly and carefully. We could bury you this afternoon if I felt like it. Just watch it, that's all. Just watch it. He turned and strode from the cabin. Outside, he wondered why he was not ashamed of himself. The Compass Rose, let's just say she doesn't emerge unscathed from the war. Let's just put it that way. And this book is like that. It's an incredibly eloquent and thoughtful evocation of what it's like to be at war in wild, horrible circumstances against an unrelenting and largely unseen enemy. I think it is rewarded every rereading that I've given to it. I've read this book many, many times, and I love it more each time I find something new in it. I think the author was on fire when he wrote it, and I think he knew it. I think he knew it. I think that his publisher knew it right away when they got the manuscript. And he went on from here to do a whole bunch of other stuff. He wrote a ton of other books. There's a novella called HMS Marlborough Will Enter Harbor that is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. The ship is cracked apart by a torpedo, but does not sink. And it becomes a matter of pride to survive long enough to enter harbor. And also The Ship That Died of Shame, which is... this book was criticized, some critics criticized as being moralistically simple. The Ship That Died of Shame, if anything, was a response to those critics because it is morally complex in the extreme. And the author wrote a bunch of other things too. He went on from the war to serve in the Foreign Services Department of his government and wrote novels based on that you know, there are still ships and harbors and seamen and whatnot, but they deal a lot more with the people on land. And they sold well. They sold really well. I don't think they're what he's going to be remembered for. I think this book is what he's going to be remembered for. He wrote another wartime novel as well, a big, thick thing called The Capellan of Malta, which is incredible. Really ought to be back in print. It's not as just note perfect as this book. Sometimes just lightning strikes an author, and when that happens and they write a book in that mood, nothing touches that book, even when the rest of their books are technically proficient or even good, really good. The Capellan of Malta is a novel that anyone else, someone who had not written The Cruel Sea, would consider rightfully the high point of their writing career. Certainly it would be listed as the top 5 novels that, for instance, a writer like Anthony Burgess could claim. It's just that this author had already written his one great book when he got around to that. And he was working the whole time that he was working on, well, not this book, but from the 60s on. All the time he had in the back of his mind that one book, that one big roving book that all novelists tend to have on a back burner, steadily filling folders with clippings and snatches when you don't want to write something else, you just want to work on that book a little. All authors, especially all historical fiction authors, have that book, that one book. And usually it never sees the light of day because usually it's unfinished when the author died. And the whole time that this author was writing his Corvette books and his autobiographies and his land fiction and his sea fiction, he was also working on a book like that. A variation on the myth of the wandering Jew, where in this case it's of course naval. There's a naval officer who commits an unbelievable act of treachery and especially cowardice, and is cursed to wander to work the Earth's oceans forever. And the working title was Master Mariner, and it was going to be immense, probably a series of books, because this author is immortal. He goes from sea venue to sea venue, so all of the major sea happenings of the last 400 years in the West, he's the perfect linchpin to narrate them all. The author never got around to finishing that book. His estate and his publisher did publish it, even in its unfinished form. You can find a mass market paperback of it, I guess. It very much reads unfinished, unfortunately, I think. And it was, again, really, really good. But the book I want to recommend for 2If by Sea this time around is The Cruel Sea. I do not know. I intentionally did not check to see if The Cruel Sea is in print. It would break my heart if it isn't. But even if it isn't in print, this is one instance where I don't have any trouble in telling you to go hunting for it because it had 1 million editions. 1 million editions. In the UK and America. This was an American edition. Also, Penguin brought it out in an edition. The hardcovers, God, there are 1 million copies of this book floating around. So you can certainly find one. And if you haven't heard about it, haven't ever read it, and you're interested, especially in war fiction, this is a classic, right up there with The Killer Angels. So I want to recommend the book. I also want to recommend the author. Aside maybe from Master Mariner, everything else, if you ever encounter a book with this author's name on it, like for instance, Pan, I think, did 60 years ago, they did little paperbacks of, like, for instance, the shorter books, the novellas. Three Corvettes, I think, was in one of those paperbacks. If you ever see this author's name on a book, even if it's not The Cruel Sea, you might like him. He's very good company. But even so, I know that I get nonfiction next month. I don't think I'm going to do his memoirs next month. I think I'm going to move on to something else. But I couldn't do To If by Sea much longer without recommending this author and especially this book. So that's what I'm going to do for this time around. And I will leave a link to Mark's video as well. He's doing fiction this time around. And then we'll be back next month with another pairing. Next month I will have nonfiction. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.